Do you want something to happen in your level when the player is in a certain spot? Then you need a trigger. To start, we'll go to the Basic tab in the Modes panel and pull out a box trigger. I'll lift my trigger above the floor and hit End to snap it into the ground. Notice how the bottom edge of the trigger is flickering? That is because it is occupying the same space as the top plane of our floor, an effect known as Z-fighting. I'm going to move it up a touch to stop that. I want the event to fire the moment the player enters the airlock I made, so I'm going to expand it to fill the space. Notice how when I expand the trigger on the x-axis, the value under the box extant changes, not the x scale? That's because Unreal is assuming, correctly, that I want to change the dimensions of the trigger. If we modified the X scale, then every component on this actor would have their X scale changed. If we had a static mesh component on this trigger, for example, it would stretch as well. By using the extent, we only change the size of the trigger box. Since we scale from the middle of our object, when I try to make this trigger taller, it will also expand through the floor. A good trick for scaling an object that's already lined up is to increase the scale until you're halfway to the size you want. So I'll expand the Z extent until my trigger is halfway to the ceiling. Since it expanded in both directions, when I move the bottom of my trigger to the floor, the top touches the ceiling. Note, I can't hit N to snap my trigger to the floor because it intersects the walls. We have two other options under our shape category besides the box extent. We can change the thickness of the lines that draw the edges of our trigger. This only shows up in the editor, but this can make our trigger easier to see while testing. We can also change the color of our lines, useful when we have multiple triggers in the same area and want to be able to tell them apart. We can scroll down to the rendering category to change when our trigger is shown. By default, our triggers will not appear when we hit play. When we try that out, you can see the trigger isn't visible. If we set actor hidden in game to false, then our trigger volumes will be rendered even in play mode. This is useful for testing and debugging. To keep things organized, I'm going to rename this trigger. I can do that at the top of the details page by double clicking on the trigger in the outline, hitting F2 with the trigger selected, or right clicking it, going to edit, and selecting rename. I'll call this one trigger airlock. That may sound backwards, but by naming objects by their type and then instance, we will automatically organize them together in the outliner's alphabetized list. In order to get this trigger to do something, it needs to be a blueprint. In the top right of the details page, I can select the blue button to turn this trigger into a blueprint object. A very common practice among Unreal developers is to use acronyms at the start of assets to denote their type. For blueprints, this is BP underscore. Make sure to save this asset in your blueprints folder. If you don't have a blueprints folder, create one now. After you convert an actor into a blueprint object, the blueprint window automatically opens. We have three panels in our main window. The viewport shows us all the components of our blueprint, displayed as we will see them in our scene. Right now, all I have is the trigger box. The construction script is run every time the actor is created before gameplay starts. We'll worry about that later. This event graph is basically identical to the level blueprint's event graph, but instead of being tied to our scene, this is tied to our object. We have an extra default event in this blueprint, event actor begin overlap. This event fires when another actor overlaps our object. To start, let's print a debug message whenever somebody enters our trigger. Remember to keep your blueprints neat and organized. You can always press Q to straighten your notes. Since I put this trigger in my airlock, I'll use the message entered airlock. That's all I want to do for now, so I'm going to put these nodes in a comment and title it check for player entering airlock. I'm going to tighten up the comment and then compile and save. Now we can go back to our main viewport and play it to test our script. It looks like the mouse control prompt is covering our message, so let's go back and increase the time our message is on screen so it's easier to see. Don't forget to compile and save. Let's hit play and walk in. We can see our debug message after the viewport message goes away. Now we know that walking into the trigger is being detected. We can use this process of printing strings when we enter triggers to test our blueprints and make sure our nodes are functioning correctly. This is a fundamental tool in our box for implementing functionality in levels. That's all for now. Don't forget to save.